Boldwood presents The Winter Waif, written by Lynette Rees and read by Deryn Edwards. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Part 1. Chapter 1. Merthyr Tydfil, South Wales, 1884. From the corner of the living room, 12-year-old Betsan Morgan watched her mam working away on her sewing machine. The whirring of the machine and mam's rhythmic tapping of her foot on the treadle as she fed the material through were a comfort to her. The jabbering of the needle as it moved up and down was quite mesmerising at times. Betsan made a little sketch with her notepad and pencil of the partially finished gown her mother was creating, which was displayed on a wooden mannequin against the wall. Mam had made such a fine job of it so far. It was being created for a schoolmistress called Cynthia Eastwood, who lived in a large house in the Pont Morlais area of the town. Whenever Mam created a new garment, Betsan enjoyed sketching it to keep as a memento of her mother's handiwork. This particular dress had a fine vertical blue stripe running through its white heavy cotton, and soon it would have a lace insert added to the bodice, collar and cuffs. The whirring ceased for a moment, and Mam turned around in her chair. "Will you please pass me a piece of that lace from my work-basket, Cariad?" Betsan nodded, laying down her pencil and notebook, immediately knowing which piece of lace her mother meant. It was Belgian, and she'd purchased it from a stall at Merthyr Market just last week. People came from far and wide to their modest home in Plymouth Street for her mother to make garments for them. Sometimes it was several girls' petticoats she needed to run up, or a man's work shirt. Usually items her mother could complete quite quickly, though on occasions she had made a bridal gown, a party dress or a day gown, like she was making today. Often people arrived at the house with clothes that needed repairing, that they couldn't afford to throw away, so it wasn't unusual for her customers to stay and wait while she hemmed a pair of trousers or shortened a skirt. Earlier, a lady from Abercynaid had arrived, and Betsan was dispatched to make a cup of tea for her while they waited until Mam had finished taking up the sleeves on a jacket for her. The kettle was on the hob all day long at home, and Betsan liked that. She'd often perch on a little stool in the corner of the room, listening to the adults gossiping away, though sometimes she hardly understood what they meant. "Have you heard about Miss—" one such customer had said to her mother recently. "No," Mam had said, shaking her head. "She's having trouble with you-know-who." The woman had pursed her lips and crossed her hands one over the other in a disapproving fashion. Her mother had nodded sympathetically. Mam wasn't one for gossip. She'd listen all right, but she wasn't the sort who would spread malicious tales around the area. Betsan scrabbled about in her mother's wicker work-basket until she located the beautiful white Belgian lace, which was wound around a small piece of card, and she handed it to her. Her mother smiled. "Once I've done this, we'll have some tea and crumpets, shall we?" Betsan nodded eagerly. She loved these times with her mother. Her 3-year-old twin siblings, Aled and Alice, were being cared for next door by a good friend and neighbour to them all, the elderly Bronwen Jenkins. Dad was at work at the Star Inn again. He worked all hours there. If he wasn't manning the bar or dealing with unruly customers, then he was supervising deliveries of barrels of ale or helping to clean up the place ready for opening time, though that establishment hardly ever seemed to close. She'd been in there a couple of times, and the strong smell of beer fumes and smoke made her feel like throwing up, though she guessed Dad was used to it. The sewing machine sprang into action again, and it wasn't a minute or two before her mam coughed. One of her winter coughs, she'd called it. But she seemed to be coughing more than usual today. A knock on the living room door caused them to turn their heads. It was Bronwen Jenkins. Her salt and pepper-coloured hair was visible as she peered around the doorway before she simply walked in, as she was prone to do. "Hello, both," she said in her strong West Walian accent. "I've just left the twins with Bert a moment, as I wondered if—" She didn't get to finish what she was saying, as Mam interrupted with another cough. Bronwyn stared at her. "Gwendolen, now there's a nasty cough you have there." Mam nodded. "Oh, I'll be all right." "Why don't you get yourself off to bed for a spell? I can mind the children a little while longer. Betsan can come next door as well." Mam shook her head and smiled weakly. "If only I were able to. The rest would do me good. But I have a gown that needs completing today." "I wish I could help you with that," Mrs. Jenkins chuckled. "I'm that cack-handed, though, I'd mess it up for you. Always had fingers like sausages." She winked at Betsan, who smiled in amusement as the woman wriggled her fingers. "Thank you. I appreciate the thought. I'll pop back next door to fetch that bottle of cough medicine I had from Dr. Llewellyn last month when Bert was ill. That'll do the trick for you. There's enough left in the bottle until you can buy some yourself." Betsan's mother nodded gratefully. "And I'll stop for a few minutes to brew up some tea." "We were going to toast some crumpets on the fork in front of the fire," said Betsan, hoping her mother hadn't forgotten that. "Well, if that's what you want to do, then I shall help you." Mrs. Jenkins smiled, and then she turned and left the room, closing the door behind her to keep the heat in. "Isn't that kind of her?" said Mam, looking at Betsan. "I really need to get back to my work now, but it will be a help if Mrs. Jenkins brews up and toasts those crumpets for us." Betsan stared hard at her mother. She really didn't look at all well this morning, and Betsan wondered if her father realised just how sick she was becoming lately. Mam placed the flat of her hand on her chest and coughed again. Without even being told to do so, Betsan lifted the metal tongs from the fireplace and placed an extra couple of lumps of coal from the brass scuttle onto the fire. It was the least she could do. She felt a sense of relief when Mrs. Jenkins returned with a brown bottle of medicine, the cork making a plopping sound as she opened it to pour a spoonful for her mother. That should make her Mam better, surely. By tea-time, when her father was due home from work for a couple of hours before his evening shift, Betsan had expected her mother to be a little better, but in fact, her condition had worsened. Thankfully, she'd managed to complete the day gown for Miss Eastwood, who'd arrived to collect it. Pleased with the result, she'd paid what was owed and went on her way. Hadn't she even noticed how pale Mam looked? The woman must have had other things on her mind, as she seemed in a rush and had left shortly afterwards. The oil lamp was lit on the windowsill, while her mother lay on the couch beneath. The lamp reflected a yellowy glow, which highlighted the gaunt shadows beneath her mother's eyes. Mam hadn't managed to complete all her work after all, as there were some petticoats she'd promised to a customer. She'd instructed Betsan to send any callers around to Bronwyn's house, where their neighbour would explain what had happened and tell them that when Gwendolen was better in a day or two, the work would be completed. When Dad returned home, he walked into the living room as he always did, usually with something cheerful to say to them all. But Betsan realised there was something up when the twins were kept next door instead of returning home. He asked, blinking his large, dark eyes, looking full of concern. "Mam's not been at all well today." Betsan shook her head sadly. "Oh, Gwen, what's the matter, my sweet?" He was now on his knees at his wife's side, where she still lay reclining on the sofa, her eyes closing. She seemed unable to keep them open, even for Betsan's father. He held her hand and touched her brow. "Fetch a cold, wet flannel." He looked at Betsan. "She's burning up. Your mother's got some sort of fever." Betsan did as told. She couldn't find the flannel her mam used to wipe the twins' faces, so she dipped a spare tray cloth in a bowl of water, rinsed it out, and passed it to her father, who proceeded to gently wipe her mother's brow.